There comes a moment, quiet, unannounced, almost invisible, when life stops asking and starts demanding. It often happens in the late 60s, long before the candles on the 70th birthday cake, when something deep inside you stirs. At first, it feels like a shift in the background noise of your mind, a faint discomfort you can't name. But then it grows. Jung believed that the second half of life is not about achievements or reputation, it is about truth. And truth, when it finally knocks, is not soft. It is persistent. It is precise. It is personal. This is when the persona, the mask you've worn for survival, respect and acceptance, begins to crack. The strong father, the quiet mother, the loyal worker, the good friend, the peacekeeper, all these roles you carried like armor start to feel too heavy for the body that once wore them easily. You notice it in the mirror, in the way you talk, in the way you suddenly stop pretending you enjoy certain things. Something inside begins whispering, "Enough." And the whisper is both frightening and familiar, like a voice you once knew but chose to ignore. Then comes the shadow, not the monster that many imagine, but the messenger Jung described. Everything about you that you hid, denied, or silenced, the anger you swallowed. The fears you hid behind a smile, the dreams you buried beneath duty, the boundaries you never dared to defend. Jung said, what you resist not only persists, but grows. And in this phase of life, the shadow grows loud. It doesn't come to harm you, it comes to be recognized. Think of a man named Arturo, who worked for decades as a calm, reliable supervisor. Everyone respected him, everyone admired his patience. But in his late 60s, after retirement, his family noticed something strange. He became irritable, blunt, almost brutally honest. What nobody realized was that he had spent a lifetime suppressing his own needs to keep the peace. His entire identity had been built on a persona of calmness. The moment he no longer needed to perform that role, the shadow surged forward, demanding balance. He wasn't becoming worse. He was becoming honest, but because he never understood this side of himself, it frightened him. Or consider a friend who always acted confident, always led every project with pride. But when he turned 68, he confessed that his confidence had been a mask. He spent years projecting his insecurity onto others, criticizing their decisions because he feared his own inadequacy. Jung called this projection the transfer of our own darkness onto another. And in the quiet years before 70, those projections return home. They reveal what they were hiding. This awakening is not a punishment, it is the beginning of individuation, the process Jung described as becoming your true self, the self that exists beneath your achievements and your failures. It is the self that waits patiently for you to stop performing and start listening. And here lies the warning. The unhealed parts of you do not disappear with age. They do not fade. They follow you. And as the horizon of time grows closer, they knock louder, asking for the truth you once avoided. The question is, will you finally open the door? There is a moment in life, quiet, almost invisible, when the mask you spent decades perfecting begins to crumble, and you can feel the first fracture before anyone else notices. It's subtle at first, a slip in your tone, a sudden irritation, a truth you never intended to speak aloud. But it grows. Carl Jung warned that the persona is a complicated system of relations between the individual consciousness and society, a mask built to please the world, but one that often silences the real self. And by the time someone reaches their 70s, that mask becomes too heavy to hold up. Gravity doesn't just pull at the body. It pulls at the soul. Imagine a man named Arturo, known for 40 years in his office as the Gentle One. He was the kind of colleague everyone trusted. Polite, predictable, calm even under pressure. His persona was spotless. But what no one knew was that Arturo swallowed every frustration he ever felt. When a co-worker stole credit for his work, he smiled. When his boss humiliated him in meetings, he apologized. When his brother mocked his decisions, he stayed quiet to keep the peace. For decades, Arturo believed this patience was virtue. In reality, it was repression wearing a polite face. Then came retirement. The applause faded, the routine vanished, the expectations disappeared, and with them, the mask lost its purpose. One afternoon, during a simple family discussion about dinner plans, Arturo exploded in rage so sudden that even he didn't recognize himself. His wife whispered later, "You never used to be like this." But the truth is chilling. He had always been like this. He had just trapped his anger in the shadow, the hidden chamber of the psyche where everything unexpressed grows heavier. This is the tragic irony Jung spoke of. The shadow doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It waits. And the older you become, the thinner the persona becomes, until the pressure from within pushes through. Jung said, "What you resist not only persists, but grows in size." Arturo's suppressed truth, his resentment, his frustration, his longing to be heard, had been gaining strength for decades. Now, without the structure of work or the distractions of youth, the real Arturo began to leak through the cracks. You may have seen this happen before. A quiet father suddenly becomes impatient in his later years. A calm grandmother starts speaking truths she never dared say. A friendly neighbor begins revealing bitterness you never imagined he carried. And society calls it old age. But psychologically, it's not age, it's exposure. When the persona weakens, the shadow steps forward. There's a mystery here, one many people never discover until too late. The parts of yourself you deny in youth return demanding attention. In old age, the unresolved emotions, ignored dreams, hidden anger, they all rise, not to punish you, but to be integrated. This is the beginning of individuation, the long journey toward the self, and it often begins the moment your mask slips for the first time. Arturo eventually realized something profound. His anger wasn't a flaw, it was a message. A message that he had lived as a character instead of a person. A message that the persona he used to survive had turned into a prison he no longer had the strength to maintain. And so, the question hangs in the air, almost like a warning. What happens when the mask you wore for 40 years suddenly betrays you? Comment if you've ever seen someone's mask slip after many years. The persona protects you in youth, but betrays you in age. You can live an entire lifetime believing you have buried something, until one day it knocks on your door with the force of everything you refuse to feel. That is the nature of the shadow. It doesn't disappear. It waits. It grows. It gathers all the parts of you that you hid behind politeness, responsibility, and a carefully crafted persona. Jung warned that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Most people don't realize this until much later in life, when the mask becomes too heavy and the truth becomes too loud. The shadow is not evil. It is simply the part of you you didn't want the world to see. The jealousy you buried under forced smiles, the ambition you disguised as humility, the anger you softened so people wouldn't call you difficult. The boundaries you never set because you wanted to be loved. Jung believed that every persona, every good image we project, comes with a cost. Whatever doesn't fit that image gets pushed into the dark. But darkness is patient, and the older we get, the thinner that persona becomes, like old paper revealing the ink underneath. Imagine a woman named Elena. Her entire life, she was known as the caring one in her family. She cooked for everyone, babysat grandchildren, stayed quiet during conflicts, and forgave even when she was the one who was hurt. People admired her kindness, yet no one ever asked what she needed. For decades, she swallowed her resentment, smiling through exhaustion. But when she turned 70, something unexpected happened. She began withdrawing. She became distant during gatherings. She stopped answering calls. Her children whispered, "She's changed." But the real story was far more haunting. She was finally meeting the parts of herself she had abandoned. Her silence was not coldness, it was her shadow speaking for the first time. This happens more often than we like to admit. A gentle man suddenly becomes bitter in old age. A quiet friend becomes confrontational. A peaceful colleague erupts over small issues. People say, "They're getting older," but that's the surface explanation. The deeper truth is that age pulls the shadow upward. When time grows shorter, the mind no longer tolerates lies we told ourselves for decades. There is no energy left to maintain the persona. The repressed anger, the ignored boundaries, the silenced truth, all of it rises with an urgency that feels like personality change, but is actually self-revelation. Jung called this the return of the shadow, a psychological reckoning that forces you to face the parts you have abandoned. If you denied your needs, they return as resentment. If you buried your anger, it returns as bitterness. If you suppressed your ambition, it returns as regret. And if you chose peace over honesty, it returns as an inner war. This is why some people become unpredictable later in life. They're not collapsing, they're correcting. There is a dramatic irony to this truth. The very traits we fear showing the world are the ones that rise with the greatest power when time is running out. And this is not punishment, it is the mind's last attempt at wholeness. Individuation, Jung said, becomes unavoidable as we age. The real self begins to surface, demanding to be acknowledged before the final chapter closes, and so the warning becomes clear, almost prophetic. What you avoid in your 40s will confront you in your 70s. The question is whether you will meet it as an enemy, or finally welcome it home. What you refuse to face in your 40s will confront you in your 70s. There is a moment in life when the truth stops knocking and starts breaking the door down, and that moment usually arrives after 60. At that age, the stories we told ourselves for decades begin to collapse, one by one, and the mind reaches for its final shield. Projection. Jung described projection as the act of throwing our own rejected qualities onto others so we don't have to face them within ourselves. It is the shadow's last defense. Instead of confronting our fear, we call others cowardly. Instead of admitting our envy, we label others ungrateful. Instead of accepting our own rigidity, we judge others for being too sensitive. And the older we get, the more desperate this inner trick becomes, because time is running out to hide from who we truly are. Imagine a retired man named Alvaro. All his life, he feared being seen as inadequate. But instead of facing that fear, he built a persona of strict discipline, calling himself a man of standards. At work, he criticized younger colleagues for being unfocused, even though he was the one terrified of failing. At home, he accused his son of being irresponsible, when in truth he was projecting his own secret regrets about choices he never dared to make. For decades, the projection worked. People either stayed quiet or avoided him. But when Alvaro turned 70, something shifted. His world became smaller, fewer distractions, fewer roles to hide behind. And with that shrinking world came a rising anger he couldn't explain. He blamed the neighbors for being noisy, the government for being corrupt, the family for being distant. But what he didn't know, what the audience can see with chilling clarity, is that none of these things were the real cause. The war he fought was inside him. He was fighting the parts of himself he had exiled years ago. This is the dramatic irony of projection. The very flaw we refuse to accept in ourselves becomes the flaw we see everywhere around us. Jung warned us of this when he said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But most people never reach that understanding. Instead, they spend their later years in a storm of resentment, unable to recognize that the storm is of their own making. They accuse others of disrespect, of betrayal, of selfish intentions, without realizing that these accusations reveal more about their own inner conflicts than about the world. Here is where the danger rises. In late life, unresolved projections crystallize. They turn into fixed beliefs, into bitterness, into isolation. A man who once blamed others lightly now does so with force, because his identity depends on it. The shadow becomes louder as the persona weakens, and the truth he avoided for decades begins to whisper through every crack in the armor. You are never angry at them, you are angry at yourself. And unless you dare to face that shadow, peace will always slip through your fingers. So ask yourself, have you ever watched someone attack others for the very flaw they secretly feared in themselves? A jealous friend accusing everyone else of betrayal. A controlling parent calling others immature. A colleague demanding loyalty while hiding their own insecurity. These are not coincidences. They are psychological shadows trying to escape the mirror. The real question is, when the mirror calls for you, will you look? We stop blaming others the moment we dare to look in the mirror. There is a moment in later life when dreams stop being soft whispers and start becoming alarms. It happens quietly, almost secretly, as people cross into their late 60s and approach 70, when the unconscious realizes something the waking mind refuses to admit. Time is no longer unlimited, and so the psyche does what it has always done throughout your life. It sends messages in the only language it knows. Symbols, scenarios, emotions, and stories that feel strangely real. Jung believed that when the ego becomes too stiff, too defended, too proud to face its truth, the unconscious steps forward through dreams to deliver one final warning. But these are not ordinary dreams. They are sharper, heavier, more emotionally charged. They carry the weight of unfinished business. Jung once wrote, "The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul. And when that door swings open in later life, what comes through is everything you suppressed for decades. Desires you buried to keep peace, anger you denied to maintain your persona, guilt you pretended not to feel, and versions of yourself you abandoned because life demanded the safer mask." The persona weakens with age, and in the cracks the shadow steps forward, often first appearing at night. A man who ignored his ambition dreams of racing toward a train he can never catch. A woman who always played the caregiver dreams of sitting alone at a banquet where everyone else is served but her. These scenes are symbolic mirrors, reflecting what the waking mind avoids. Consider a story that many therapists quietly recognize. A retired teacher, respected for his wisdom, his kindness, and his calm voice, begins having the same dream every week. In the dream, he stands in a long hallway lined with locked doors. He tries each one, but they won't open. He wakes up frustrated, confused, sweating. His family thinks he's just stressed, but the symbolism is clear. Throughout his life, he avoided conflict, swallowed his anger, and played the role of the gentle one. He never said what hurt him. He never demanded respect. He kept the peace even when it cost him his identity. Now, in his dreams, the unconscious shows him the rooms he never entered, the emotional truths he refused to face. The tragedy is that he does not understand the message. The dramatic irony is that the locked rooms are not his problem. They are his invitation. Dreams in the later decades of life are not random. They are attempts at psychological integration, the final stage of individuation when the self tries to unify all its parts into one coherent identity. Before the journey ends, Jung argued that the unconscious becomes more active in old age because the ego is weaker, less defended, more porous. What was repressed rises, what was denied returns. What was ignored demands recognition. That is why older adults often dream about people they haven't thought of in decades, ex-partners, childhood friends, past enemies, old rivals, even deceased parents. These figures are archetypal messengers, carrying emotions the conscious mind tried to bury. The question is not why the dream is happening. The real question is, why now? Because the psyche wants closure, it wants truth, it wants integration, and it knows the window is closing. One woman described dreaming of a burning house over and over. In the dream, she stands outside, watching flames rise from the windows, but she never goes inside. She wakes up terrified. For months, she assumes it's anxiety or fear of aging, but the symbol is far deeper. For years, she lived with resentment she never admitted, anger she never allowed herself to feel. She put everyone first and herself last. The burning house was not destruction, it was purification. It was her shadow asking to be acknowledged before her life story ended without honesty. But she didn't understand the message until much later, when she finally confessed, "I spent my life being who they wanted, not who I was." Her dream had told her that truth long before she dared say it. This is why Jung believed dream intensity increases with age. The unconscious becomes louder because the ego becomes quieter. And when the unconscious senses that a person is running out of years to resolve their inner conflicts, the symbols sharpen, the emotions intensify, and the messages become urgent. Whether it is a storm, a collapsing bridge, a stranger calling your name, or a childhood friend walking away in silence. The dream is not random. It is a negotiation between the life you lived and the life you avoided. The dream world is asking you the same question. It asks everyone approaching 70, will you finally listen? Dreams intensify when the soul knows you're running out of time. There comes a moment, quiet, abrupt, almost eerie, when a person realizes that age doesn't automatically bring wisdom. It only exposes whatever has been hiding beneath the surface. This is the moment the elder archetype awakens. Jung believed that each phase of life calls forth a new psychological pattern, a new inner character meant to guide the soul. In youth we fight, we explore, we conquer. In midlife we protect, build and nurture. But in late life, something deeper arrives. The elder, the inner figure whose purpose is not survival, but meaning. And yet, what most people never expect is that this archetype has two faces. One brings peace, the other brings decay. Jung warned that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. He meant that whatever you avoid, suppress, or deny eventually leaks into the world around you, especially in old age. The elder archetype does not let you run from your past. It forces you toward it. If you spent your youth hiding from your shadow, pretending to be someone you're not, keeping your persona tightly stitched together, the elder tears those stitches wide open. Suddenly, the mask no longer holds. The shadow steps forward, and the person you truly became, not the one you advertised, comes into full view. Imagine two people approaching their 70s. The first is a retired school principal named Harun. All his life, he believed he had to be the strong one, the man who never cried, never faltered, never admitted sadness. His persona was built on control, but now, as the elder archetype rises, cracks appear. He grows irritable. Small mistakes annoy him. He snaps at his grandchildren. Family members whisper that he has changed. But in reality, he hasn't changed at all. He has finally stopped controlling the truth. His shadow, decades of fear and unspoken vulnerability, has seeped through. He becomes the bitter elder, not because age made him harsh, but because a lifetime of emotional avoidance left him unprepared for truth. Then there is Mrs. Rashida, once a quiet librarian who lived most of her life feeling invisible. But unlike Harun, she spent her later years confronting the wounds she once ignored, her loneliness, her envy, her self-doubt. She journaled, she reflected. She forgave herself. And now, in her 70s, she has become unexpectedly radiant. Her presence feels calming, her words carry weight, her laughter is soft but real. She has integrated her shadow. She has accepted her story. The elder within her is wise because the self within her is whole. Here lies the mysterious irony. Growing older doesn't shape your essence, it reveals it. The elder archetype holds up a mirror no one can escape. For some, it becomes a portal to wisdom. For others, a doorway into long-suppressed bitterness. And the most haunting part is this. Everyone around you can see which path you took long before you admitted yourself. This is why Jung believed that individuation, the lifelong process of uniting your conscious self with your hidden parts, is the greatest task of the second half of life. If you avoid it, the elder archetype becomes your judge. If you embrace it, the elder becomes your guide. And so, as this inner figure rises, the question becomes unavoidable. What will it reveal about you when the mask is finally gone? The elder reveals who you became, not who you pretended to be. Something strange happens when a person reaches their 70s. The identity they spent decades building suddenly begins to crack. It feels like standing in a quiet room and hearing a noise behind the walls, a reminder that something long ignored is finally moving. Many panic and say, "I don't know who I am anymore." But what if this frightening collapse is not destruction, but revelation? Jung believed that late life strips away anything that was borrowed, forced, or performed. The persona, the mask you wore for survival, starts to crumble because it no longer fits the life you're entering, and the shadow, the part of you that waited in silence, begins to rise and demand truth. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But that privilege often arrives disguised as a crisis. For example, imagine a man named Victor who spent his whole career as a respected corporate leader. People admired him. He was decisive, confident, unshakable, or so it seemed. When he retired at 72, the glow of authority vanished overnight. He no longer had a title to hide behind. He no longer had employees to validate him, and slowly, an emptiness he had ignored for decades began to echo inside him. His friends said, "Victor is finally slowing down." But the truth was far deeper. Victor wasn't slowing down. Victor was collapsing. For the first time in his life, he noticed that he felt small, insecure, even afraid. Not because he lost his job, but because his persona did. He didn't know how to live without it. Dramatic irony fills moments like these. The world believes a person has become fragile, while in reality, they are beginning the most sincere chapter of their psychological life. The collapse of the false self is not failure. It is the doorway to individuation, the process Jung described as becoming whole. Sometimes this collapse arrives quietly. A mother who lived through her children might realize the house is silent, and so is her purpose. A man whose entire identity was built on being strong might find himself crying without knowing why a friend who always kept everyone laughing might suddenly withdraw, unable to maintain the mask. These are not signs of weakness. These are signs that the shadow has stepped forward and said, "Enough pretending." One of the great paradoxes of aging is this. Just when the world expects you to know who you are, life forces you to face the truth that you never really knew. The ego resists. It says, "Hold the mask together." But the soul whispers, "Let it fall." And when it falls, you meet the parts of yourself you postponed, your fears, your needs, your forgotten dreams, your quiet wisdom. The collapse of the false self is frightening, yes. But it is also sacred, because only when the mask shatters can the face beneath finally breathe. And this is where the real journey begins. The journey inward, the journey toward authenticity, the journey that no longer depends on applause, roles, or expectations. Sometimes life must take away who you were, so you can meet who you are. There comes a moment in late life when the people around you stop being just companions and become mirrors that expose truths you spent decades avoiding. It's subtle at first, a comment from a friend that stings more than it should, a pattern you suddenly notice in your family, a loneliness that feels strangely familiar. But with age, the noise of youth fades, and what remains is a quiet, honest reflection. Jung believed that every relationship is a psychological mirror, revealing aspects of the shadow, the persona, and the wounds we refuse to look at when we still had time to run from them. He warned, everything that irritates us in others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. And in old age, irritations turn into revelations. Think of a man named Samuel. All his life, he was known as the easygoing one. He avoided conflict, kept the peace, and never expressed anger, not at work, not at home, not even with friends who crossed his boundaries. People admired him for being calm and composed, but what he never saw was how this persona, the mask of the nice man, slowly attracted people who used him. Dominant co-workers leaned on him to take extra tasks. His wife made all decisions without asking. His friends rarely considered his needs. When Samuel turned 70, something shifted. His children rarely visited. His siblings assumed he preferred space. His friends stopped calling, and for the first time he felt a strange ache in his chest. Not sadness, recognition. He realized he had trained the world to believe he needed nothing. His silence had become his own prison. Relationships, Jung said, reflect the shadow, the parts of us we deny. Samuel denied his anger, so he attracted people who took advantage. He denied his needs, so he surrounded himself with those who never asked what he wanted. In his youth, he could explain it away. Busy years, stressful jobs, obligations. But in old age, excuses fall apart. What remains is the truth that was always there, whispering behind every broken boundary. And the irony is tragic. Samuel spent a lifetime trying not to be a burden, only to feel invisible in the years when he needed closeness the most. Now picture a woman named Ruth. She grew up believing she had to be strong, never cry, never ask for help, never show weakness. Her persona was built like a fortress. She became the reliable one, the glue of the family. But inside, her shadow held a deep fear of abandonment she never confronted. In her 70s, Ruth felt confused watching her adult children rarely open up to her. She thought they were being distant, unexpressive, independent to a fault. But the truth was far more painful. They had learned emotional distance from her. She had modeled silence so well that intimacy felt unnatural to them. The irony, she now craved the very warmth she once denied herself. There is a strange clarity that comes with aging, a clarity that feels both like a gift and a warning. Relationships stop being random. They reveal patterns, they expose wounds, they serve as quiet teachers, showing you where you abandoned yourself. Jung understood this deeply. To him, individuation, the journey toward becoming your true self, requires facing the truth of who you've been in relation to others. The older you grow, the more these truths knock on your door, and they do not knock softly. That is why so many older people say, "I finally understand my relationships." It isn't wisdom alone, it's the loss of distraction. When time grows shorter, truth grows louder. You begin to see that the people who surround you are not an accident. They are reflections of the lessons you avoided, repeated until you finally recognize them. Some mirrors will show you your strength. Others will show wounds you hoped no one would notice. And a few will expose shadows you believed you buried long ago. But here lies the quiet revelation. These mirrors are not punishments, they are invitations. Invitations to confront the patterns, break the illusions, and reclaim the parts of yourself you abandoned to maintain peace. Because the relationships you attract are not just connections, they are messages. And the older you get, the clearer those messages become. Look closely at the people around you. They are telling you a story about you that you may not have been ready to hear when you were young. But now, with age, the message becomes impossible to ignore, and the next step is to decide what you will do with what you finally see. The relationships you attract reveal the lessons you avoided. There comes a moment, usually late in life, when a person feels something shifting inside them, a strange calm mixed with an unsettling clarity, like the quiet after a long storm. It is in this silence that the final great psychological task begins. Individuation. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole, of integrating every part of yourself, the parts you show, the parts you hide, and the parts you denied for decades. It is not a journey toward perfection. It is a journey toward truth. And truth, especially near the end of life, becomes impossible to avoid. Individuation demands courage, because it forces you to face the shadow, the side of you that holds your anger, envy, fears, regrets, desires, and the memories you tried to bury. It also softens the persona, the mask you wore to be liked, respected, or accepted. When these two forces finally meet, something unexpected happens. The real self emerges. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Individuation is that moment when you stop calling it fate and start calling it truth. Imagine an older man named Samuel. For most of his life, he acted like the perfect father, calm, patient, always in control. But he carried deep guilt for the nights he wasn't there, for the words he never said, for the affection he withheld because he was raised to believe men must be stoic. In his 70s, something begins to crack open. Not in a dramatic breakdown, but in a quiet surrender. One evening, while holding an old photo of his son, he finally whispers an apology to himself. And for the first time, he feels the weight lift. This is not weakness. This is individuation, the acceptance of his shadow, the softening of his persona, the merging of who he was and who he pretended to be. Or picture an elderly woman named Helena who spent her whole life pleasing others. She never admitted her ambition, her hunger for art, her secret dream of traveling alone. These desires lived in her shadow for decades, but as she ages, the urgency of time pushes the truth upward. She begins painting again. She speaks honestly. She stops apologizing. People say she's changed. But the truth is the opposite. She has finally stopped changing for others. Individuation was waiting for her all along. Individuation also reveals the archetypes we lived through unconsciously, the caretaker who forgot herself, the hero who never allowed weakness, the rebel who feared freedom, the protector who never allowed himself to be protected. As these inner characters come into awareness, a person experiences something profound, inner unity. The contradictions stop fighting. The self no longer lives in fragments. There is a foreshadowing in every life, a slow building toward this final integration. Some resist it and grow bitter. Others answer it and grow free. And those who reach individuation before their final years experience the rarest psychological gift, inner peace that no one can take away. Individuation does not arrive with age alone. It arrives when someone finally chooses honesty over image, courage over denial, and wholeness over perfection. Jung believed that this final integration is the soul's greatest moment of liberation. At the end of life, the greatest victory is to become yourself. There is a moment in late life, quiet, unexpected, almost invisible, when the truth finally steps out from behind the mask you've worn for decades. It doesn't arrive with thunder. It arrives with pressure. According to Jung, the shadow becomes most visible when the persona can no longer hold itself together, and by the time someone reaches their late 60s or early 70s, the persona, those lifelong roles of the responsible one, the strong one, the peaceful one, begins to crack. What escapes through those cracks is not new. It is what has been waiting. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Late life stress reveals exactly what has been directing someone all along. Health scares, financial strain, loneliness, family conflict, or the sudden loss of structure after retirement. All these pressures act like a psychological X-ray. They strip away titles, roles, and social habits. What remains is the real self, whether someone is ready to meet it or not. Imagine an elderly man named Harris. All his life, he was known as a patient, thoughtful leader at work. People admired how calm he stayed under pressure. But when he retired, something shifted. Without his routine, his power, or the respect of a team relying on him, the calm persona dissolved. Suddenly, he snapped over small things, criticized his wife harshly, and grew suspicious of others. His family whispered, "He's changed." But Jung would say the opposite. Harris didn't change. His shadow, decades of hidden insecurity and control, finally surfaced now that the persona no longer had a stage to stand on. Or picture Elena, a woman who spent her life being the listener. She supported everyone, her children, siblings, neighbors. But after a minor surgery left her temporarily dependent on others, her kindness flipped. She became cold, short-tempered, even resentful. Her daughter said, "She's never been like this." But the truth is deeper. Without her role as the fixer, the shadow of frustration and unmet needs rose to the surface. Pressure didn't corrupt her. It revealed her. This is the dramatic irony of late life. What people assume is a new behavior is actually old truth. The shadow that had been pushed aside by responsibilities, distractions, and social roles can no longer hide. And this test, this late-life revelation, distinguishes those who grow from those who deny. Some respond with humility, finally admitting their wounds. Others double down on projection, blaming everyone else. A few, the bravest, see the shadow and say, "This is my unfinished work." This is why the years between 65 and 75 are psychologically critical. It is the last major confrontation between the self you pretended to be and the self you truly are. And its outcome shapes the final chapter of a life, either peace or bitterness, clarity or confusion, authenticity or regret. The question is simple but unsettling. When pressure arrives, which self will answer? Pressure doesn't create your shadow, it exposes it. Jung wrote that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. But there's a deeper twist that often goes unnoticed. As you age, the unlived parts of your own life, your silenced desires, your ignored needs, your forgotten hurts, begin demanding recognition. The shadow, which for decades quietly stored these unmet emotions, starts to speak, and because the persona weakens with age, there is no longer enough strength to hide behind roles, duties, or distractions. What returns is raw, unfiltered truth. Picture an older man named Samuel, a respected teacher who spent his whole life being calm, logical, and emotionally controlled. Everyone admired his stability. But what no one knew was that as a child, Samuel grew up in a home where anger was dangerous, where a raised voice meant chaos was coming, so he learned to stay silent, to avoid conflict, to become the easy one. But at 72, something shifts. He finds himself craving reassurance from his adult children. He becomes easily startled by small disagreements. He even apologizes too much, without knowing why. His family thinks he is getting sensitive with age, but the truth is far more profound. His inner child, the frightened boy who survived by staying invisible, has finally come to the surface, asking to be seen. This is the mystery Jung tried to explain. Childhood does not disappear, it waits. And the psyche, driven by archetypal rhythms, eventually circles back to the beginning. This return is part of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole. Early wounds resurface not because you are falling apart, but because the unfinished parts of your story want closure. There is dramatic irony here. The very emotions you avoided in youth return in old age precisely because you are finally strong enough to face them. Another example. Imagine a woman named Elaine who grew up in a loud, unstable home. She learned to survive by becoming the peacemaker, the caretaker, the one who smoothed everything over. She built her adult life around stability, quiet routines, predictable friendships, safe choices. But now, at 75, she finds herself anxious in situations she once handled easily. A small change in schedule, a forgotten appointment, a sudden noise, all make her uneasy. She doesn't understand why. Yet the reason lies deep in the unconscious. Her inner child, who once lived in chaos, is reacting to the slightest signs of unpredictability. Elaine believes she is getting old and nervous, but in truth her psyche is asking her to acknowledge the chaos she survived. This resurfacing of childhood wounds is not regression, it is integration. The inner child is not coming back to weaken you. It is coming back to be healed by the adult you have become. Jung believed that the psyche seeks wholeness, and that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In old age, the darkness that must be made conscious is often your earliest pain. What once threatened to break you now comes seeking your understanding. There is also a subtle foreshadowing in this stage of life. The psyche is preparing you for individuation's final steps. Before the journey ends, it brings all your lost pieces home. Old fears, old longings, old memories. They all return, not as enemies, but as messengers carrying truths you once had no strength to face. And this is why, after 70, so many people begin remembering childhood with surprising clarity. The psyche is not trying to re-traumatize you. It is trying to complete you. The wounds return because the time for healing has finally arrived. What returns in old age is not weakness, it is unfinished childhood. This emergence is subtle at first. It might look like a man who no longer reacts to insults, not because he is weak, but because he finally sees through the noise. Or a woman who stops chasing validation and speaks with calm clarity. As if her voice has finally found its center, Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And this is the exact moment when that privilege reveals itself. The true character rises not with drama, but with depth, steady, grounded, unmistakably real. Picture this. An old colleague named Harris, once defensive and sharp-tongued, always blaming others for his frustrations. In his 40s, he lived inside his persona, the image of the competent, unfazed professional. But in private, he was scared, insecure, and constantly projecting his fears onto others. Every mistake he made became someone else's fault. Every weakness he felt became a flaw he accused others of having. He was trapped in a maze he built himself. But then something changed after he turned 70. He became quieter, thoughtful, unbothered by the chaos around him. His old temper disappeared like a forgotten storm. At lunch one day, he admitted, in a soft voice no one had ever heard from him, that he spent half his life running from his shadow, and it exhausted him. "I was angry at everyone," he said. "But the truth is, I was angry at myself." There was no shame in his tone, only freedom. This is the wise awakening Jung spoke about. The moment the self steps forward and the false identities collapse. These people do not give advice to impress. They don't need to win arguments. Their wisdom is quiet, almost sacred. They look at others with compassion because they finally understand the long battle every human fights inside their own mind. And there is dramatic irony in this. The person who spent decades trying to look strong finally becomes strong the moment they stop performing. The person who feared being misunderstood finally becomes clear the moment they stop explaining. The person who carried guilt for years finally feels forgiven the moment they forgive themselves. What makes this transformation mysterious is how others sense it instantly. You feel calmer in their presence. You trust them without knowing why they have nothing to prove, and yet they carry a presence more powerful than any title they ever held. Jung believed this was the deepest form of individuation, the moment when the self no longer hides behind the ego, but walks openly, confidently, truthfully. This is why some older people radiate peace. They are not pretending anymore. They are not wrestling with projections. They are not hiding behind persona, and they are not building walls against their shadow. They have integrated all parts of themselves and emerged whole. Their true character, no longer diluted by old fears, finally comes into view. And here is the unavoidable question: if this awakening depends on truth, reflection, and courage, will you be ready when your moment comes? Your true character is revealed the moment you stop needing approval. Jung believed that the final stage of individuation happens here, in the last psychological doorway of life. It is the merging of every fragmented part. The persona you showed the world, the shadow you tried to bury, the child you once were, the adult you struggled to become, and the elder you finally returned to being. He said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." In old age, that unconscious finally steps forward, not as an enemy, but as a companion demanding honesty. The final mirror does not lie because it cannot lie. It shows you the person you created through your choices, your silences, your courage, and your fears. Imagine an older man named Halim. All his life, he pretended to be the strong, unshakable one, the man who handled everything, who never broke down, who always smiled at the right moments. People admired him. They called him dependable. But what they never saw was the shadow he pushed down, his loneliness, his guilt, and the anger he carried toward himself for not living the life he truly wanted. When Halim reached 78, he began having dreams of a locked blue door. He didn't understand it at first, but slowly he realized the truth. Behind that door was the part of him he abandoned long ago, the artist he once dreamed of becoming, the man who wanted to speak honestly, the soul he hid to maintain his perfect image. The door was his final mirror. The irony? In his last years, when he believed change was impossible, he finally spoke honestly to his family. He cried for the first time in decades, and in that vulnerability, he felt more alive than he had at any other moment. This is what Jung meant by final integration, the soul's last attempt to bring everything together before the curtain closes. Some people feel peace in this moment because they lived close to their truth. Others feel regret because they lived behind armor. Most feel a painful mix of both, and that mix is what makes them human. But Jung insisted on something powerful. It's never too late. Even at 70, 80, or 90, the psyche still tries to heal, still tries to unify your story, still tries to free you from the lies you carried for too long. Think of an older woman named Syra, who spent years blaming others, her children, her co-workers, her ex-husband, for her disappointments. She projected her frustrations onto everyone around her, never realizing that she was running from her own shadow of unspoken fear. But when she entered her final years, something shifted. She began remembering moments she had forgotten, the choices she avoided, the chances she never took, the words she swallowed. For the first time, she saw her life not as a chain of betrayals, but as a map of unconscious patterns she never understood. And in that moment of clarity, she stopped blaming. She forgave. She softened. She understood herself. And that understanding brought her the peace she had been fighting for all her life. This is the haunting beauty of the final mirror. It forces you to stop running. It allows you to forgive yourself. It allows you to return to the center you abandoned. And even if the past cannot change, the ending still can. The last chapter of life is not about perfection, it is about truth. It is the moment when masks fall, shadows speak, archetypes dissolve, and the whole self stands together for the first and last time. Because the final mirror is not about judgment, it is about understanding. In the end, the life you face is the one you created. You cannot control time, you cannot control aging, but you can control how deeply you know yourself. Jung's teachings warn us that the shadows we avoid return later. Louder, the masks we wear eventually crack, and the unhealed parts of our childhood will always ask to be seen. But if you choose self-awareness, today, right now, you don't have to wait until your 70s to meet your true self. You can start unmasking, you can start listening, you can start integrating. Because in the end, understanding others begins with understanding yourself. Know yourself now, and you won't fear who you become later.